Hello again. This is the Fantasy Sultans podcast. He is the Hall of Famer Mike Sheck. I am Tripp Rogers. Welcome to, the postmortem for Week 18. And the Fantasy Sultans, of course, the fantasy season, for all intents and purposes, is over. I think last week we saw ample evidence why, if your team goes to Week 18, that league stinks. Because I am telling you, somebody lost the championship because of all the players that were sitting last weekend, Week 18. And Mike, I mean, you talk about Week 18. The story of Week 18 was the ones who didn't play. And again, it was a regular smorgasbord of fantasy gold, I guess you could say.
Yeah, and I mean that's going to happen. That's why one of the reasons why we hate having championship on week 18. Few leagues do it, but it's one of those things that it's tough because
Yes.
you're playing that late in the season. You know that some teams are going to rest their starters getting ready for the playoffs. I mean, Philadelphia was a prime example. Take a look at what happened with Saquon Barkley. He could have gotten the record 101 yards. I mean, but why would you want to risk an injury to your star player only to break a record? So, I mean,
Yeah.
again,
Yeah.
fantasy is one of those things where, week 17, that's when the championship gets played. And, some leagues actually do it in week 16. We know in our Best Buy league, that's a
Yeah.
13-week season,
Yeah.
regular season, and then they do the playoffs. So it's done in week 16. So, I mean, hey, I'm all right with that too.
It is one of those damned if you do, damned if you don't types of things. And again, the story on week 18, obviously, there was basically there were two playoff berths that were real, two playoff berths. The number seven seeds were really all that was decided,
Yeah.
aside from the NFC South, because the NFC South was the only division that was available. Everything else was clinched. And that, of course, it proceeded to have some drama between the Tampa Bay Buccaneers and the Atlanta Falcons. Both games were seesaw games, and Tampa Bay won their game. That effectively closed the door to Atlanta. And, it didn't, Atlanta's result did not matter at that point. But, and of course, then the other issue was the number seven seed. It was Denver's to control. They went into Kansas City, or excuse me, they hosted Kansas City, and Kansas City rested everybody, and they beat Kansas City 38-0. And again, we said last week, when was the last time you saw a double digit number one seed as an underdog? And somebody knew what was going on. As somebody knew what was going to happen in this game, because the Chiefs just, and again, we've seen it with Andy Reid. I mean, you and I were in the New Jersey area, New York, New Jersey, Philadelphia area, and we saw with Andy Reid with the Eagles teams in the early 2000s, when he had nothing to play for at the end of the season, he rested everybody. Week 16, week 17, took a lot of heat on that,
Hmm.
but they were able to make deep runs into the playoffs, and that was a hallmark. And Reid continues to do that as long as there's nothing to play for. He's getting his starters out because their health in the postseason is very important.
And
So
a quarterback that really looked fantastic up until week 18 was Sam Darnold. And then what
yes,
happened? The wheels kind of
yes.
fell off. And I think he might have put on a Jet uniform. Did somebody misinform him that his uniform should have been purple and not green? I'm not so sure about that, but
Well,
it was just not a good performance. And then, of course, we got to talk about the coaches that were fired on Black Monday.
yeah.
Well, one team got the party started early. That was the New England Patriots, 90 minutes after the game ended, after they won in Buffalo, against Buffalo, I should say. They fired Gerard Mayo. You also have Doug Peterson, former Philadelphia Eagles coach, Jacksonville head coach, getting the boot. Also, Antonio Pierce in Las Vegas, kind of to be expected. He had like a 18-month window there with the Raiders, just not effective there. And Rand Carthon, how about that for a GM getting fired in Tennessee? Not Brian Callahan, who we maybe, if you listen to our Sunday with the Fantasy Sultans show, we kind of debated, well, maybe Brian Callahan in Tennessee might have been a coach in the mix to get
Yes.
fired. Well, he was not, but Rand Carthon was.
And, Mike, you brought up something very interesting that I wanted to bring up at the start of our podcast today because this will be the last podcast we're going to have until the week between these championship games and the Super Bowl, actually just before the Super Bowl, because as we said, fantasy season for all intents and purposes is done. But listen, the Fantasy Sultans are always hard at work. And
Mhm.
you can catch our Sunday shows, Sunday with the Fantasy Sultans. Mike, tell them where they can listen to it.
Yeah, you could hear us on Fox Sports Radio New Jersey, Fox Sports Radio Jersey Shore, and Fox Sports Radio New Jersey.com. Again, it's 93.5 FM, 1450 AM in Central Jersey at the Jersey Shore, 100.1 HD3, 95.9 HD3, and of course at Fox Sports Radio New Jersey.com. Sunday at noon, Sunday with the Fantasy Sultans.
And we'll be having that show will be on every week. So I just
Yeah.
wanted to mention that. I want to make sure we get a mention. We'll mention it again at the end of the show. So let's talk a little bit about the fantasy season that was. And we usually do a review. And Mike, we have our fantasy gold and our fantasy mold. And again, part of the fantasy gold and fantasy mold segment, we probably you could probably tell who we're going to say or what we're going to do because we had Fantasy Festivus and the airing of fantasy grievances. So those grievances turn into fantasy mold. I'm just saying. It's amazing how the things kind of all work together. Mike, who you got for fantasy gold?
I'm going with Baltimore quarterback Lamar Jackson. Over 4,100 passing yards, 41 touchdowns, 380 total fantasy points. He averaged 30 points per game and led all quarterbacks with rushing yards with 915. That Ravens offense as a whole with Jackson in there, as JJ Jackson would say, dynamite.
No,
That's right. The superstar
no, JJ
quarterback
Walker, not
was
JJ
stellar.
Jackson. JJ Walker.
Oh yeah, JJ Walker. That's right.
Come on, you got to get our references right. Come on, man.
I know. But the superstar quarterback, he was stellar in all formats during the divisional round, championship games, and you know what? Threw less than no touchdowns. So, no temporary layoffs in Baltimore, only good times. I'm going to stay with the quarterbacks. I'm going to go to fantasy gold with Josh Allen of the Buffalo Bills. 3,731 yards, 28 touchdowns, a rating of 101.3, over 360 fantasy points. Biggest flaw for Allen basically was the fact that against New England in week number 16, that was kind of his worst week. And if you had him, he only got 13 fantasy points, and that could have costed you your matchup maybe in the playoffs. So that's the only situation. Otherwise, he was fantastic all year. A running back, Saquon Barkley. I don't need to tell you again, Tripp, about this. You've heard this time and time again with the New York Giants, but in Philadelphia, basically just phenomenal. 345 carries, over 2,000 yards. We talked about it, 101 away from breaking Eric Dickerson's record held back in 1984. 13 touchdowns, total 260 fantasy points. Philly's bread and butter, so to speak. He got it done. And, I think this was his best season since he came in as a rookie in 2018 and led the league with over 2,000 scrimmage yards. So, a great performance from Saquon. He's had some injuries here and there in between that, not so good performances, but he was also on the New York Giants, had a struggling time with their offensive line. But with Saquon Barkley, if you drafted him, boy, did you get your money's worth. Another player you got your money's worth, Cincinnati wide receiver Jamar Chase. 127 receptions, 1,700 yards, 17 touchdowns. That is first among all wide receivers. He actually got the trifecta too, scoring 20 PPR points 8 times, at least 25 PPR points 5 times, at least 40 PPR points 3 times, and one game with at least 50 PPR points. A guy that has been dominant at his position has definitely been Jamar Chase. I'm going to throw another wide receiver in there. Tampa Bay's Mike Evans. Now, he was a stud for the Bucks. I mean, 11 consecutive seasons with 1,000 or more yards in a season, really showing that he was a cornerstone of fantasy lineups. He delivered multi-touchdown performances in the playoffs. Definitely a true wide receiver one if you started him. He had some injuries. I mean, he was out a few games, but I mean, by far, Evans was a player that if you drafted him, again, you got your money's worth. All right, Tripp, who's your fantasy gold?
Well, fantasy gold. I mean, listen, I've got a couple. First off, I got to talk about the combination of Jameer Gibbs and David Montgomery in
Yeah.
Detroit. That Detroit offense was really good, and I think the best thing I did in the fantasies in the Sultans league was to draft both of them. And I got to tell you, it paid off big dividends. And when Montgomery got hurt late in the season, Gibbs took over, and Gibbs was able to get what he normally got and then some, because also that Detroit offense was so good with Jared Goff. And, listen, Amon St. Brown was great. Amon
Yep.
Ross St. Brown was great. And the other part of that, Sam Laporta, the tight end, he was good. But how about the resurrection of Tim Patrick? Tim Patrick was on no one's radar, nobody's radar. And I think, if I'm not mistaken, it was the two people who are on the screen right now who said, "Get Tim Patrick." And we
Hmm.
said that early enough that had you acted, you would have gotten him. And down the stretch, he was gold. So he is fantasy gold. I want to go with a couple other people. One of the ways I look at gold, in my estimation, is when you drafted him or her, him or her. Right? There's no hers. It's him. When you are them, when you drafted
Yeah.
them, and I came up with two that were drafted kind of latter part of the draft, back half of the draft. One was Cortland Sutton with Denver. Now, at the time, Cortland Sutton was in the 9th round of our fan, and this is our Sultans draft, by the way, is what I was using for this. And again, the question mark about Bo Nix, the question about the Denver offense, because of the fact that they struggled so much last year. Russell Wilson was cut, the whole 9 yards. But Sean Payton really put it together. That offense in Denver was clicking, and Cortland Sutton, oh, he was a fantasy stud. He definitely was fantasy gold. And then you want to talk about rookies, and in fact, I'm going to throw two rookies at you. First of all, tight end Brock Bowers. He was the cornerstone of the offense in Las Vegas. He was the man, and he led. In fact, if I'm not mistaken, well, he led rookie receivers with receptions. Again, he wasn't the first overall, but he led the rookies with receptions. And again, it was a nice rookie class, because you got to throw Malik Neighbors in there too, because he did a great job too. Both had over 100 catches this year. Brock Bowers was great, and I also want to talk about another rookie from Georgia, Ladd McConkey, who played with the LA Chargers. Again, a guy who was drafted in the 10th round in the Sultans League. He was a guy that was available later on. He really put together a great rookie campaign. He was steady. And again, he became a weapon for that Los Angeles Chargers offense, which I know Justin Herbert was there, and of course, Jim Harbaugh took over this year. But you didn't know what was going to happen. And that Charger team, boy, they have put things together, and they, of course, made the playoffs. So that's a very important thing. All right, let's go to the flip side, and we're going to talk about fantasy mold. We're going to talk about the bread you're throwing out. These are the guys you'd like to throw out, but, well, we'll be nice. Obviously, the number one on the fantasy mold list, Christian McCaffrey.
Yeah.
If you drafted him, it was a nightmare for you, because all of a sudden Christian McCaffrey out week 1. And that was in the inactives. They said he was going to play. And that then led to a stint on IR. And he didn't come back until week 9. And he was okay. I don't know, McCaffrey, rocked the world, but but again, two guys on your screen right now. As I recall, we kind of threw some cold water on that 49ers offense, saying, I don't know about this. I don't know. And Mike shaking his head, the Hall of Famer knows. We're kind of down on Christian McCaffrey, so
Yeah.
he definitely gets the mold list. Let's go to the NYJ. RB1 of the NYJ, Breece Hall. Everybody said, this guy's going to have a great year. The Jets are going to be great. They're going to go to the playoffs. Aaron Rodgers is going to be wonderful. None of those storylines worked out. They fired their coach 5 weeks in. The interim head coach was awful. The defense, which was the cornerstone under Robert Saleh, was awful. Aaron Rodgers, awful. Breece Hall, awful. They're going to reset themselves with the Jets. But Breece Hall, who was a top running back pick, and he went first round, did not work out well this year. So he is definitely fantasy mold. I want to throw Tyreek Hill on the bonfire as fantasy mold. Tyreek Hill was good until about week 5. And then all of a sudden, the wrist that he hurt in the traffic stop before the first game became an issue. And his fantasy production fell off. Even when Tua came back, you thought, okay, Tyreek's coming back. No. Awful. And of course, he pulled himself out of the game last week. We won't go into that. We don't know what the story is. And he said supposedly he asked for a trade out of Miami, but has not requested a trade. So who knows what's going to go on there. But Tyreek Hill, definitely fantasy mold this year because he did not live up to expectations. Now, let's see what happens in the offseason. Maybe he will be good. My last addition on the fantasy mold squad, Michael Pittman Jr. Michael Pittman Jr., they said, was going to have a great year. Great year. He had Anthony Richardson at quarterback. Richardson, of course, found himself benched. Of course, he also took himself out when he said he was winded. He tapped out. That was not good. Joe Flacco came in, showed us some signs in one game, and then reverted back to a 40-year-old quarterback. Gee, where have we heard that story before? Aaron Rodgers? Michael Pittman Jr., a very disappointing year. I will be very surprised if Michael Pittman Jr., I think probably you can look at him in the second or third round next year. He is not going in the first round, definitely not after this season. Michael, the Hall of Famer, has his fantasy mold list.
You talked about the stale bread. I'm talking about the cheese. These players are not Gouda. They're more like blue cheese. I'll start it off with Patrick Mahomes from the Kansas City Chiefs. I know he's on a team with a 15-2 record, has 3 Super Bowl rings, and yet I'm saying he's fantasy mold. Well, yeah, I guess that's a bit harsh, but he's been borderline unstartable in fantasy. In his first 7 games, he was quarterback 13. Not a good performance. I mean, the only good thing about him was when it counted down the stretch late in the season, especially in the fantasy playoffs, he turned out his best performances. But that is if you made it to the playoffs with him. If not, what good was he? So,
Yeah.
I mean, again, fantasy mold. Speaking of disappointments, might not be no more bigger disappointment than San Francisco wide receiver Deebo Samuel. In general, we talked about the 49ers and Christian McCaffrey. The whole team just failed to perform basically 1 year removed from the Super Bowl. I mean, you talk about teams that go through Super Bowl hangovers, and that was certainly the case with the 49ers, but it was also injuries that really hurt the 49ers as well. He had
Yeah.
some opportunities. Brandon Ayuk had a season, well, an off season where, we didn't even know if he was going to be playing for the 49ers. The opportunity was there for Samuel because at the beginning of the season, Ayuk wasn't that good. Then he got injured after week number 8. So more opportunity for Samuel, and yet he just could not get the job done. So that's why I am saying Samuel is for certain fantasy mold. Another player who fell flat, Jacksonville running back Travis Etienne. had a preseason ADP of a running back 10. And because of his, sophomore season, I mean, we kind of expected a bit more. 265 rushing attempts, 1,000 rushing yards, 11 touchdowns, 70 plus targets. We didn't really know how disappointing he would really be. I mean, were we maybe just a year early on Tank Bisbee? I mean, Etienne and Bisbee, they played the whole season together, but Bigsby had a larger share of the rushing attack, and Etienne just 558 yards, 2 touchdowns on the season. I'm going to go to tight end Kyle Pitts in Atlanta. Now, Pitts has played 4 seasons in the NFL and only has 9 touchdowns to show for it, which is the exact same amount Mark Andrews scored in 1 season that we called a bit disappointing. So, I mean, you have to go back to his rookie season when he had 53 catches. Most recently, he's averaging 2.7 receptions per game. And you really don't need to be a math major to know that's only 48 catches in a season. But then again, are we surprised? No, because maybe this is the last year we allow ourselves to be disappointed by Kyle Pitts, because otherwise it's just frankly human nature. And you know that song, I'm Only Human, Born to Make Mistakes? Kyle Pitts, that's you.
Humanly,
There you go, wrapping up my
1983.
fantasy mold right
Human.
there. Yep.
What?
I said that wraps up my fantasy mold.
On our Fantasy Sultan podcast. Okay. A feature we like to do, we do it every year. The way too early top 12 for the upcoming season. Yes, we tell you who you're going to draft in September. Way too early rankings. Okay. I will go first. My top 12, Saquon Barkley at number 1. And listen, there are those who kind of disagree with this, but Saquon, you cannot deny the year Saquon has. And this Eagle team, I think, is built. They can only get better. Remember, we had the question about would the Eagles' offensive line be good without Jason Kelce? I think they are. Number 2 seed in the NFC. Not bad. I think Saquon will follow up this big year with another good year. He'll go off number RB1, and he'll go off number 1 in a lot of drafts. Could be yours, too. Number 2, Jamar Chase. Mike, you really touched on it. Jamar Chase had a great year. Joe Burrow had a great season. The Cincinnati Bengals team, not so much. The Bengals team, of course, did not make the playoffs. And again, part of it was the defense, which was awful, but they certainly had a good game against Pittsburgh last Saturday. Jamar Chase, number 2 on the draft board. Number 3, wide receiver Puka Nacua for the Los Angeles Rams. And it reminded me what I should have put on fantasy mold, Cooper Kupp. Cooper Kupp was good, and all of a sudden, last half of the season was terrible. Puka Nacua, though, injured, missed some games, but he has been a fantasy star over the course of the last 4 or 5 games. Definitely think next year the offense in Los Angeles is going to run through Puka Nacua. Well, pass through Puka Nacua because he's not a runner. But I'll go Puka Nacua, number 3. Number 4, Bijan Robinson of the Atlanta Falcons, running back. Again, he had a good year this year, although he had some of his carries taken by Tyler Algier. But I think this Falcons offense is going to run through Bijan, and I think we finally saw some glimpses of what he was going to do this year, what we were expecting of him last year, and he did this year without Arthur Smith. Number 5, wide receiver Justin Jefferson of the Minnesota Vikings. I mean, the Vikings are in the playoffs. Justin Jefferson is a beast in fantasy. And Sam Darnold had a great year, but that's going to be one of the questions going forward. Who is going to be quarterback? You could see Justin Jefferson's draft position affected by who is going to quarterback for the Minnesota Vikings. But right now he is at number 5. Number 6, I got wide receiver CeeDee Lamb of Dallas. He got paid this year. But again, talk about injuries decimating a team. Dak Prescott. I mean, Cooper Rush was okay, but the Dallas Cowboys were a mess. This is a huge issue, and the question, of course, in the coming days, what happens to Mike McCarthy. I go back, and I'll say this on our Sunday with the Fantasy Sultans, and I think I hinted at it. Yeah, I hinted at it last week, in fact. I think it's going to be monkey see, monkey do. And I think if the Dallas Cowboys are now out, I don't know if they'll make a coaching change. But if the Philadelphia Eagles flame out in the first round of the playoffs, I definitely think Nick Sirianni is in trouble. I think whatever Dallas does, the Eagles will do, and vice versa. So I think if they fire Sirianni, then I think Jerry Jones is going to fire Mike McCarthy, or vice versa. Because again, I cannot see a scenario where Sirianni comes back because of all the issues that he had off the field this year. And I think if the Eagles flame out in the first round, that's going to be huge. Although I think they're going to go places. Number 7, Nico Collins of Houston. Injuries robbed fantasy owners of him. He was great this season. He was a shining star. While C.J. Stroud did not do as well as he had done in the past, Nico Collins certainly was his number one receiver and his favorite target. And I think that justifies him at number 7 in our way too early fantasy draft. Number 8, Jahmyr Gibbs of the Detroit Lions. Again, I talked about it, Fantasy Gold. He had a monster season. He and David Montgomery, probably the best running back pair in the NFL. And that Detroit offense is so good. But obviously the question will be, what happens with their offensive coordinator, Ben Johnson? He's one of the reasons why this team is so good. And again, I think Jahmyr, though, will be one of the top running backs. Number 9, Devon Achane for the Miami Dolphins. I mean, Mike McDaniel didn't get stupid all of a sudden. That was a team that had injuries. And I think the thing that the Miami Dolphins have got to do, they've got to keep Tua on the field. I think that's the most important thing, because this offense really did not just sputtered very badly when Tua was not in the lineup. And when he came back in the lineup, he didn't do that well either. They need everything. The only person who was halfway decent this year was Achane, and he had a good year and didn't have any injuries. So I think he is justified at that number 9 spot. Number 10, wide receiver Brian Thomas Jr. of the Jacksonville Jaguars. Fine rookie season for him. In fact, saw him in the game against the Jets, and he was really good. Even though, Trevor Lawrence had a very bad season and then went down with the injury, Mac Jones was able to hook up with him. Brian Thomas, definitely justified with the number 1 pick last year, and he's a guy that will move into your top 12. Number 11, wide receiver Malik Nabers for the New York Giants, probably the only positive this season besides Tyrone Tracy for the New York Giants on offense, because Malik Nabers, as I said, over 100 catches this year. He was a guy you really had to contain if you wanted. Well, I shouldn't say that, because it's the New York Giants. Their defense stunk. Their offensive line stunk. But Nabers was a standout, and he is at number 11 on my list. At number 12, tight end Brock Bowers for the Las Vegas Raiders. Bowers coming out of Georgia, I knew he was going to be good. He was great at Georgia. He went to the Las Vegas Raiders, even with middling quarterback play. I mean, they get themselves a quarterback, that team is going to be good. I mean, if the draft predictions are there, Shedeur Sanders goes to the Vegas Raiders. Oh, man, you give this guy a decent quarterback, Brock Bowers could be a star, an absolute stud. I think he's number 12 on my list. Mike, who have you got as your way too early top 12?
Well, after a running back dominant 2024, I'm going to say that 2025 is the revenge of the receiver, or call it the receiver strikes back. I'm going to put 3 receivers in my top 5: Jamar Chase, CeeDee Lamb, and Justin Jefferson. Now, I agree with you about Saquon. I mean, you cannot take away with what he did. I'm just going to flip your 1 and 2. I'm going to say Jamar Chase is 1, Saquon is number 2. The trifecta for Jamar Chase in catches, touchdown receptions, and yards, he's got to be number 1. Saquon Barkley, I think the reason why he's number 2 is he's going to be 28 years old. That's a touch older than Jamar Chase. He's also has an injury history. And, he's kind of reminds me a little bit like Christian McCaffrey in an extent. So when he's healthy, he's phenomenal. But when he's injured, we're going to put him in the Christian McCaffrey category.
Yeah.
So that's why he's my number two. I'm going to go with CeeDee Lamb as number three. Uh, 3 straight seasons with at least 150 targets and 100 catches. Number four, I'll go with Jahmyr Gibbs, the workhorse for Detroit. He finished as an RB overall number one, trailed only Saquon Barkley and Chase among all players in points per game. Number five, I'll go with Justin Jefferson in Minnesota, 18.7 points per game. Questions like you mentioned, who's going to be throwing him the ball? Sam Darnold, JJ McCarthy, somebody even else? We don't know. Daniel Jones, who knows? I don't think it really matters though. Just go out and draft him. Justin Jefferson is going to be phenomenal again next year. Six is going to go to Derrick Henry, and he was King Henry for Baltimore. 16 touchdowns, four overall at the position. Now, age could be a factor. He's going to be
Hmm.
31, but I
Hmm.
really don't see any signs of him slowing down anytime soon. Just look at what he did this year. And I know the bell curve with running backs seems to be about 30 years old, a little under the 30 mark. You got to watch those, that bell curve with running backs, but it was not the case with Derrick Henry. Seven, I'm going to go with Devon Achane of Miami. 23 touchdowns in 23 regular season games. Where's Mel Gibson when you need him? Because he's a lethal weapon in fantasy. I'm going to go number eight, Amon-Ra St. Brown. 3 straight seasons with at least 106 receptions, over 1,100 yards, and 22 touchdown catches over the past 2 seasons. Number nine, Puka Nacua from the Los Angeles Rams. And I think he could be putting up a season close to Cooper Kupp's in 2021. If you remember what Cooper Kupp did in 2021, Puka Nacua is the guy you're going to want to draft next year. 10, wide receiver A.J. Brown of Philadelphia. Again, him and Hurts were great. I mean, outside of Saquon Barkley, those were the guys. I don't care what kind of riffs they had on the in the off the field with the drama with Philadelphia, even with Sirianni and all that. They still got it done. 11, I'm going to go with Bijan Robinson. Now, he's a touch much lower than your rankings. I know you had him at number four,
Hmm.
1,800 combined yards, 20 points per game. I have him a bit lower, though, because Michael Penix Jr., I'm worried about him taking away some rushing yards and goal line opportunities in 2025. I may bump his number ADP up a bit as we go into the offseason and even closer to draft time. So, we'll watch for that. He may land in the top 10 or even somewhere in the top eight. Uh, so he's my number 11. And then finally, I'm going to go with 12. You and I are on the same page here. Brock Bowers, I have him ahead of Travis Kelce at the position. He obliterated the rookie record for catches at the tight end position with 112. I believe it can only get better in 2025, and I think he's going to have a better quarterback. Raiders look like they're probably going to draft a quarterback too. If Tom Brady has his say, he definitely wants his coach and quarterback on the same page.
Well, that was certainly interesting. Mike, I suppose since this is going to be our last podcast until the Super Bowl, obviously, how about your final, the Hall of, all right, I'll go first since I'm the one who brought it up. Final four, who
Final four.
we'll see, will battle for the NFC, or the NFC and the AFC. I think in the AFC, it's going to come down to the top two seeds. Kansas City, in order, they've got to win one game to get there, and I think they will. The path goes through Kansas City. I think Buffalo is the class of the. I think Buffalo will get through the tournament, and I think Buffalo will end up being the opponent. And I think Buffalo finally gets that chip off their shoulder. I think Buffalo will go for the Super Bowl, the AFC. In the NFC, on the Sunday with the Sultans show, I picked the Eagles to go to the Super Bowl. I also picked the Jets. 500 on that one. In the NFC, again, Detroit showed us how it was done. And Sunday's defensive performance put Aaron Glenn probably at the top or near the top of the coaching list for teams. I think Aaron Glenn's going to end up getting the job. His defense against the Vikings was stifling. And this is a Detroit defense that is hurting. They get that bye week, which is very important for them. I think Detroit is able to rebound. They'll make the championship game. The game will be in Detroit. But I think the Eagles will go into Detroit and win. I think it's the Eagles and the Bills in the Super Bowl. What say you, Hall of Famer?
I will say in the Final Four, well, NFC, I think definitely think you're going to see the two teams battling it out. It's going to be Detroit and Philadelphia. I'm going to agree with you on that one. I mean, the only concern that I have is this weekend's game that the Eagles have to play the Packers. They played them close the first time around Green Bay. And if it wasn't for Jordan Love getting injured in the fourth quarter, I'm not so sure the Eagles come out victorious in that game. So this could be a close game on Sunday. Something to watch. I mean, but the Eagles certainly they win this one. I think they can get by and get to the championship game. I'm going to say it's going to be Detroit and the Eagles, Philadelphia Eagles, and then on the AFC, again, I agree with you. Have to say that it's going to be Kansas City and Buffalo. And I said on this on our Sunday with the Fantasy Sultan show with the predictions, I said Detroit, Kansas City. I'm going to stick with that pick and say Detroit and Kansas City in Super Bowl 59.
Yeah, we shall see what happens. Again, this is our last podcast for a couple of weeks. We'll come back with another podcast before the Super Bowl, and of course, we'll talk a little bit more. By that time, we should have some clarity on the coaching. We may have some clarity on in terms of players and player movement, and then we'll of course obviously give our Super Bowl picks. But the Sunday with the Fantasy Sultan show is going to be on every Sunday through the playoffs. Mike, tell them where they can listen to it.
Yeah, you can listen to us on 93.5 FM in Central Jersey, 1450 AM, Fox Sports Radio, New Jersey. And then, of course, Fox Sports Radio, Jersey Shore. That's 100.1 HD3, 95.9 HD3. And we're on the web. You can check us out online, streaming 24/7, foxsportsradionewjersey.com.
Of course, if you have a question or a comment about the Fantasy Sultans, feel free to email us. It's fantasysultans@gmail.com. Don't forget my other podcast, Tripp's Take, that drops every Thursday morning at 9 o'clock. Find it the same spot you can find this fine podcast, Spotify creators and YouTube. Just search for Tripp's Take. You know, we've been giving it to you all year, and the work is not over. There's no off season. The Fantasy Sultans are always at work. We are working to give you the info you need to win your league. Why do we do it? We are givers. I mean, Christmas comes each and every week with the Fantasy Sultans. We give you presents. We give you the tools. We give you the info you need. We are the Fantasy Sultans.
And you are not.